All right, to everyone joining, we will start in just a couple minutes here. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Everyone is just joining here, so we'll start this in another minute or two. We've got a ton of great content here for you today, so glad you could join us, and we will start in just a couple minutes. Thanks for joining, everyone. We'll give it 60 more seconds here. We've got a ton of attendees just connecting to audio. We've got a lot of great content today and excited to present to you. So we'll start in about 60 seconds. All right, it's 11:02. We'll get started here. And just a quick housekeeping note, we will be recording this presentation as well. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you today. On behalf of CloudKnox Security and Optiv, I'd like to welcome you to Enforcing the Privilege of Least Principle in a Cloud Native World webinar. Our speaker today, we're really excited. We're joined by Michael Raggo. Michael is a senior cloud security engineer and also has his CISSP designation and is a cloud expert, frequent speaker at a lot of the security events that you may have seen or been to. So we've got a lot of great content here today. We've done this presentation before and got a lot of great questions and a lot of great feedback. So we're really excited to share with you today this presentation. So at the end of the webinar today, we will open this up for Q&A. So please feel free to utilize the chat box to send your questions throughout the webinar. Anytime a question comes up, use the chat box, send it over to us, and Michael and I will respond at the end. And without further ado, I'll turn the stage to Mike Raggo. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, everyone. This is Mike Raggo, security engineer with CloudKnox. And again, the title of this webinar is Enforcing the Principle of Least Privilege in a Cloud Native World. We appreciate you joining in today. We'll take you through our experiences in working with customers and consulting firms around the principle of least privilege and how that applies to hybrid cloud. In terms of the agenda, we'll focus on PULP, as we like to call it, and how that relates to securing your cloud infrastructure. As we work more and more with our customers, we understand that whether they are supporting AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, or even VMware, vCenter, or vSphere, managing this hybrid cloud can be quite sophisticated and quite complicated as this morphs and grows over time. And so hopefully we'll give you some really good insights about how to get your arms around these infrastructures and how to manage that in the context of least privilege. In addition, we've authored a new cyber kill chain in the context of cloud and cloud infrastructure. So we'll walk you through that, and we'll talk about some recent breaches in the context of their TTPs, or their tactics, techniques, and procedures. Furthermore, we'll also talk about many of the top challenges we encounter in working with many of the customers that we work with, and the challenges that they are trying to overcome in the context of audit and compliance, in terms of minimizing risk, and furthermore, putting in some type of life cycle that they can iterate upon over time to really right-size their environments and minimize that risk. Additionally, we'll talk about that in the context of a continuous process, and then also provide a checklist of recommended strategies going forward. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. So should you have any questions, feel free to type those in the Q&A window, and we'll tackle those at the end of this session. So the principle of least privilege, or PULP, is one of the most fundamental concepts, even predating cloud. Myself, 25, 30 years ago, as a Unix system administrator, as an Oracle DBA, even back then, when I was working for a trading floor, it was, this concept of separation of duties, this concept of least privileges. And, as a DBA or as a Unix system administrator, everybody on the team kind of had their defined permissions that would be applied to what they were allowed to access and not allowed. And this was not only to minimize risk, but also minimize the impact that somebody might not actually make a mistake and shut something down, or accidentally interfere with a running process. In today's world, though, of the cloud, we've kind of moved into a more complex, environment, and in ensuring this principle of least privilege becomes infinitely more difficult. How can you change that over time in terms of those least privileges? Is it better to assign those permissions and for a specified amount of time if you've got service accounts or non-human accounts that need to run a particular process or a batch job or a cron job, and then have that permission shut down? Furthermore, there's this concept of privilege creep over time. Developers and DevOps now have access to the entire stack. And as a result, how do we control those privileges now that, developers may have the ability to spin up their own EC2 instance or create a backup of an S3 bucket? And then in addition to all of that is the ability to also look at anomalous behaviors. And we'll talk more about this in detail. In terms of implementing least privilege and controlling these permissions, as we've mentioned, is critical to the cloud. But it's important to understand a little bit more why that is, and this process of least privilege and what does it impact. In terms of minimizing insider threat or even external attacks, it's really important to minimize the privileges across the environment to really ensure that should there actually be some form of a breach, the blast surface, as we like to call it, or the attack surface, is much more minimized. Thus, whatever may actually be exfiltrated or breached is a lot more minimized. In addition to all of that, if we take a look at some of the recent breaches, in a very prominent breach, there was an exposure of one individual identity or account that had broad access to a variety of S3 buckets within an AWS infrastructure. Ideally, that account was set up to only access one piece of storage, but as the attacker moved laterally across the cloud infrastructure, that attacker quickly determined that they had access to over 700 S3 buckets. And one of those contained very sensitive information that was later downloaded and breached as a result of having read-only access. In addition, there's this concept and the importance of audit and compliance. Many of the organizations we work with also need to ensure that they are prepared and ready for their audit to ensure that ongoing compliance over time, whether that be related to HIPAA or PCI or many of the other industry or regulatory compliances. So ensuring that you're right-sizing the environment and implementing least privilege over time and leveraging the ability to monitor that activity and leverage that monitoring and that learning to further right-size the environment on an ongoing basis is going to ultimately allow you to report on that in the context of a risk assessment, in the context of preparing for an audit and providing that evidentiary information. In addition to all of that, we also need to consider that of the stability of the environment. You know, we want to avoid accidental or intentional disruptions. If somebody has vast access to the entire environment, such as a developer, could they accidentally disable a portion of the infrastructure or take the entire infrastructure down by accident? Or if it was an insider threat, that same risk could also occur. And so again, right-sizing the environment and implementing least privilege and embracing this principle becomes increasingly important over time. And then, certainly that reputational damage. And another very prominent breach, there was a vendor whose product was exposed by virtue of the fact that their entire customer database, which resided in an S3 bucket, was actually exposed because their credentials for a particular account were actually exposed via their EC2 instance. And as a result, they had certificates, private keys, their hashed passwords, all exposed for every customer around the world. And they actually had to reach out to each and every one of those customers to install new certificates for the SSL and TLS communications. So, reputation certainly comes into play here too. So certainly, what can one line of script cost you? Well, a lot of this as developers, as administrators, DevOps, everybody across the cloud infrastructure that is supporting this becomes increasingly important in terms of what can they actually run, not only in terms of logging in with the username and password, but how secrets, how access keys, things across Azure, things across AWS and Google Cloud and more, and even VMware, is to ensure, again, that this is very much right-sized. If we loop in a cloud infrastructure kill chain analysis, we can kind of take a new approach to something that many organizations are familiar with today, and this is a cyber kill chain, but in the context of the cloud. Many of the breaches that we've seen happen across hybrid cloud, not only within AWS, but across many of the other cloud service providers, really stems from customers that may have an infrastructure that they themselves have misconfigured, and exposing resources and applications and credentials through a misconfigured web application firewall or a misconfigured S3 bucket that is public and unencrypted. Or furthermore, credentials that may have been accidentally uploaded to GitHub as a result of posting and backing up some of their code. And so as a result, these become the low-hanging fruit that is available when an attacker is performing the reconnaissance. In terms of the infiltration, it's really exploiting those resources, leveraging those IAM permissions. So should those permissions have broad access, which was the case in the two aforementioned examples that we provided in the previous slide, that vast access really allowed them to not only infiltrate the network and gain access to those sensitive resources, but also furthermore, move further into the kill chain. There's also this concept of role chaining, or in the context of AWS itself, cross-account access. And in this concept, you may have one or more identities that exist within one AWS account, but don't necessarily exist in one of the other or the secondary AWS accounts. And we work with customers that have dozens, if not hundreds of accounts. That STS assume role, that cross-account access, can allow an individual to jump from one AWS environment to a secondary environment by virtue of that policy and those permissions. But if you're solely monitoring that secondary environment, it can be really difficult to enumerate, well, who's that identity that's doing all of these things in this secondary environment? This is where privilege escalation comes into play. And should an attacker find these STS assume roles or these cross-account access in the cloud infrastructure environment, that can lead to a variety of privilege escalation. And maybe those rights and those roles and those permissions that exist in that secondary environment provide access not only to what they had primarily in dev, but now in production as well. And as we've seen with many of the breaches, that lateral movement. Did that attacker really need access to anything more than what that account had been positioned for in terms of its permissions? For example, only access to one S3 bucket as it relates to the web application. Why was it that they needed access to hundreds of others S3 buckets across the environment? And therein lies one of the fundamental problems that we see with customers, which is RBAC, or role-based access control, making assumptions on how people should be given certain roles and permissions in the environment. If Dave, the developer, comes on board and we give Dave access to the environment, by virtue of assigning them that role and providing them those permissions, is Dave really going to use all of those permissions? And then lastly, the exfiltration phase. Even with a read-only S3 bucket, provides the ability to not only access that data, but copy and download it. Again, with read-only cloud access storage. So taking a step back for a moment, we can kind of reflect upon this based on a quote that came out of what Stephen Schmidt, CISO at AWS, had provided to a senator last year. And that is, even if a customer misconfigures a resource, whether it be a firewall or something else, if the customer properly implements a least privilege policy, there is relatively very little that an attacker has access to once they are authenticated, and therefore significantly diminishing the customer's risk. So what's really important here is that implementing this least privilege, should you actually be breached at some point or another, limits that blast radius and limits what could actually be targeted and what potentially could actually be exfiltrated or breached unto itself. So certainly there's a huge uptick in organizations using the cloud here right now today, and as we've seen over the last number of years as well. As we take a look at what is contributing to this, we've got very diverse computing environments and workloads. That being that most of the organizations we work with have hybrid cloud. And the people that are responsible for that infrastructure, do they actually have the familiarity with all of the cloud service providers that they are currently using and supporting? So if they have AWS and Azure, do they apply those same concepts, those same security policies, and that same understanding to really managing that and ensuring these least privileges? And as we've mentioned earlier, developers and even DevOps now have access to the entire stack. So if we take a look at this pace of innovation, this pace of automation, because people have the ability to have access to the entire stack, for example, sometimes a developer where they can spin up an instance, they can spin up that storage, they can do backups to other storage, the pace at which all of this is being conducted is growing like a carbon life form. So as we start to take a look at, disparate authorization models, exponential growth of identities, in particular non-human, we'll talk about some of those stats, and then also the proliferation of permissions, roles, services, resources, and policies, again, this can be quite a big thing to have to manage. And we see the challenges with many of the customers that we work with. Even in preparing for an audit, today it can take them up to 6 months to really understand, their environment, how it's configured, where the risks exist, and prepare for that audit. So with the lack of automation and the ability to least privilege the environment today, it can literally take them 6 months to prepare for that next audit. So by the time they finish and they're ready for that audit and they've completed it, they're already starting the process again for the next year. The authorization models are very complex today. Even when you're leveraging an RBAC solution, again, that is largely based on assumptions. And by making those assumptions, most accounts tend to be overprivileged. One of the important stats that we see in working with our customers that is systemic across all the customers we work with is that of the permissions granted to all the individuals and even the non-human and service accounts in the organization, is that the average identity is using less than 1% of the permissions it's been granted, less than 1%. So you can see how over-provisioned these identities, these accounts, human and non-human, are across these cloud infrastructures. And this can be really difficult to right-size leveraging legacy tools. Understanding how this authorization model works and understanding how complex it is, makes it very difficult for organizations to determine, how do I right-size this? Also, we're seeing a huge increase in non-human identities, these being service accounts. And as a result, these service accounts that may be used for batch jobs in conjunction with applications or other things are not only leveraging a username and password necessarily, but more things like access keys, which may be used for APIs, the application, or even command line access. So understanding not only the identities in the context of their permissions, it's also important to understand how are access keys, for example, in AWS, being used as well. And are those actively being used, or are there any dormant keys? Have they been rotated? So as we look at the ratio of human to non-human identities, this is going to continue to grow. Today, we see that it's roughly 5 non-human accounts for every human account that we see across these CSPs. But in the next 5 years, they anticipate this to grow to 20 times that of a human account. And if we look at the permissions across the 4, CSPs that we've mentioned, right? When we take a look at, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, and VMware, vCenter, and vSphere, just think how many permissions exist across all of that. Even if you only have, let's say, Google Cloud and Azure, the quantity of permissions is very large. And so as a result, trying to right size that and trying to understand how are they used, where are they being used, and what types of policies and roles are they being used can be really, really difficult to vet out. So if we take another step back here and we think about this in the context of role-based access control, or RBAC, it can be very labor intensive to try to vet this out and really incorporate this process manually. It really just doesn't work in the cloud. It's almost the impossible task. In looking at, for example, many of the policies in AWS and having that JSON policy, trying to vet that out across your entire cloud infrastructure is nearly impossible. And in reviewing it, do you have a good understanding of, resource star, S3 star, and those things that exist within many JSON policies? So what we're saying here, yes, implementing least privilege is tough and difficult. So it really begins by asking a few questions. And this really pertains to many of the customers that we work with. For example, who can touch my cloud infrastructure? And furthermore, which permissions do they actually have? Just starting there can be really difficult for most companies. When we take a look at the permissions that have been given for, contractors, for even non-human accounts and applications, and all of those APIs. Really vetting that out is complicated. How do you analyze all of those JSON policies and also furthermore understand what permissions are being used? If you look at the permissions at a spot in time, are you really getting a good sense of, where, how, and when that account or that identity is being used? What we find is, in terms of the permissions, it becomes increasingly important to look at how that's being used over time. By default, we look at the last 90 days, and we use that to automatically create a policy that incorporates, okay, listen, the user has access to 7,000 permissions or tasks versus what they're actually using is only 25 of those 7,000 permissions. So over the last 90 days, we've only seen them use 25. Let's right size that account and allow access to only those 25 permissions. And as a result, we've now implemented least privilege. But we don't want to necessarily lock the user out. Having an approach of privilege on demand or just-in-time access is also important. So having a workflow, having a process, maybe something tied into an ITSM like a ServiceNow, also becomes important when Dave, the developer, may now need access to a new dev environment to work on a new project. Understanding what they can do with these permissions is also important. So what resources do they actually have access to? And are they using those resources? Right-sizing the environment goes beyond just the permissions, but also understanding who's actually used this resource. Do they actually need access to it, or should we right-size that as well? And then in addition to all of that, really determining how these resources can be accessed and not accessed. Are they accessed via APIs? Are they accessed using an access key? Understanding when, where, how, and why these are being used becomes super challenging, but is important to really determine and understand and right size. And the bottom line here is, how big is my insider threat surface versus my external, attack surface as well. So we want to look at this not only from an outside perspective, but also internally as well, as the risk for insider threats continues to increase. So in terms of a continuous process and treating least privilege as a continuous process really involves three key things. As part of what we do in working with customers is assessing the environment. One of the things we do following an initial deployment is to actually run a risk assessment and have a risk assessment report that provides them a lay of the land to understand where those risks exist. Again, this comes back to a number of things. One is, what permissions have been granted versus what's actually being used. If you're going to get to any level of least privilege, this is one of the most fundamental concepts that you ideally need to start with. But gaining insight into, any kind of assumptions that have been used, such as RBAC, to initially create that identity and create those roles, can allow you to determine what permissions they have. But understanding what they're actually using, is another whole concept unto itself. And furthermore, what they're using over time. In addition, whether it be roles, groups, resources, or policies, is also understanding how those are being used, what they're applied to, and also how they're changing over time. Again, these environments grow like a carbon life form. People tend to keep adding more and more and more permissions, but there's a lot less of least privilege and right sizing going on in comparison. So understanding, access to resources, how they're being used, and how they're being accessed is also important in terms of implementing least privilege. And governance, whether it be your internal governance and that life cycle in conjunction with your compliance requirements, also help define, how is this least privilege going to be, designed and informed? How's the root account, limited? And furthermore, is that using multi-factor authentication? Are there identities that have never been used or are now dormant for more than 90 days? Did human resources inform you that certain individuals have left the organization? Do you have a good way of tracking and identifying what they have access to, where those identities exist? Do they have cross-account access to other, instances or environments? Again, mapping that out is super critical in ensuring that you pass your audit. Secondly is managing. We've talked about this concept of right-sizing the permissions based on the activities and doing this over the last 90 days. This is sort of a best practice and something that we've embraced as well. That can be adjusted if you decide that you want to, create a shorter time frame or broaden that. But again, right-sizing that is not only a concept of permissions, but also time as well. We also mentioned privilege on demand, just-in-time access, and ITSM, things like ServiceNow. So we don't want to necessarily lock everybody out of the environment, right? At the end of the day, people need the access that they need in order to get their job done, in order to really accelerate their development and ensure that these applications are being deployed promptly, quickly, and in a secure fashion. So in the event that somebody does need access, is automating that workflow ideally to really provide that quick on-demand access when needed, whether it be for a human or non-human account or a service account, to ensure that it doesn't disrupt the environment. And leveraging that automation to fast track and ensure the proper life cycle for privilege of, for principle of least privilege. And then in addition to all of that is monitoring. So in addition to assess, manage in that remediation, process is also monitoring. So we want to continuously monitor for what we call privilege creep, or how these privileges creep or extend themselves over time. By doing that, we can gain a sense for how that environment is growing like a carbon life form and accurately identify where those new permissions have been assigned and ensure that, again, it's not based on assumptions, but more based on usage, based on when they're being used and how they're being used. There's also another really important concept, and this ties back to many of the breaches that have been seen, and that is, detecting anomalous behavior and tying this into your incident response playbooks. So if you work in the security team and you're looking to incorporate this into your incident response playbook, is to have the ability to identify when anomalous activity may occur. In all the breaches that we've seen, there have been new behaviors based on those accounts that have been breached that account had never done before. Maybe they only normally accessed one piece of storage, like an S3 bucket or an Azure blob. But if we now see that account accessing dozens, if not hundreds of other pieces of storage that they've never done before, despite the fact that they have access to all of that, that's a huge anomaly. Is an attacker or even an inside threat moving laterally across the network to try to find sensitive data? Having the ability to identify that in a prompt manner, and have this tied into your incident response playbook for a quick response and lockdown of that becomes super key and super critical. And this is something that we frequently do with customers as well, and actually is something that is also built into our product. So again, use that activity-based monitoring to update permissions and roles over time. So you're constantly checking this over time, and furthermore, looking for anomalous behaviors. So as we round things out here, and in a few minutes, we'll open it up for Q&A. We've got the following pulp strategies that we recommend here. First is looking for inactive identities and groups and remove them from accounts. Again, this is a life cycle itself in ensuring that as people leave the organization, or you're no longer working with a business partner or a consultant, that those identities are removed. This is no different than prior to the cloud, in ensuring that even with on-prem in those earlier days, that you remove those inactive identities. Cloud should be part of that. Secondly, look for super identities. Those are ones with permissions equivalent to root access or administrator access, and ensure those are right-sized where appropriate. Not only is that a huge risk, but again, it can cause huge impact to the environment and disruptions if one of those super identities is used either intentionally or accidentally to disrupt the environment as a whole. Some of this that also comes into play are things such as cross-account access, STS assume roles, and things like that. And so identifying that role chaining that can occur, not only in AWS, but we sometimes see this in Azure as well, also becomes super important. And then in addition to all of that, look for those over provisioned active identities and right size where appropriate. So this really gets back to a lot of the fundamentals of where we started. You know, it's not uncommon for us to see many accounts, many identities using only 1% or less of the permissions that they've been granted. So even if you've got role-based access control and a solution in place, which we complement, ensuring that those permissions are right-sized, are minimized, are key and fundamental to what we're discussing here. You can create least privilege roles based on a common set of permissions used by a group of identities. This is something that we fundamentally do within our own product in terms of right-sizing the environment. And furthermore, when we look at the scope of identities is really, again, coming back to what we've mentioned a number of times over a period of time, which is typically 90 days. And lastly, treat the non-human identities with additional oversight. A lot of these non-human identities may be using access keys or secrets for doing the types of things that they're doing within the cloud infrastructure environment through applications, or even what may be done at the command line. So whether it's a batch job, a service account, whether it be for applications and APIs, identifying those identities is really the other half of the puzzle. Many times people will look at the local accounts and look at the SAML accounts, but they forget to kind of take a look at this from a service account perspective too. So we do offer the ability to take test drive with the CloudKnox product, and this involves a risk assessment report. It's quite easy to get our product deployed in less than a day. Normally it takes 30 minutes to an hour to get initially deployed. And then over the next day or two to review the results, and we provide this in the form of a risk assessment report. And so this is something that we do offer for our customers. We evaluate the environment, we identify the areas of greatest risk, and we provide context around many of the things that we've mentioned, not only overprivileged identities with too many permissions, but we also take a look at roles and resources. We'll identify, Azure blobs or S3 buckets that are misconfigured, that are public, that are unencrypted. We'll identify inactive identities. We'll identify a subset of accounts that are not using multi-factor authentication. We'll identify those accounts that are vulnerable to privilege escalation, and much more. So we're always happy to provide a sample report so you can see what that looks like. And should you have any questions about that, happy to answer any questions you might have.